It's been a video from the BBC. It's about 5 minutes long, and it really says more in some ways than words can as to the very dishonest nature of so-called Chinese democracy. So basically, there are local elections underway, so-called elections. This is at very, very low level. Although China is well known as a single-party state, in theory, it has kind of base democracy because there are up to 2.5 million local candidates selected. Really, that's what it is, selection by the communist regime to stand as local deputies, district. It's sort of like the equivalent of councillors, I suppose, that we would have in the UK. So it's very low level. Um, but anyway, the BBC journalist, I'm not sure what his name was, and I'm not sure which part of China this was in. I've seen this guy before, but I'm not sure what his name is. Um, anyway, this was in what looked like a semi-rural area, but he went to interview a woman who was standing as an independent candidate, and they just asked her why, like what sort of issues she wanted to raise and so on. Well, as soon as he and his team, translators and so on, pulled up to the building where she and her husband were, um, up to 20 dark clothes men appeared and basically blocked the door. And they wouldn't say anything. They just kind of formed a chain to block the door. The BBC journalist kept asking, "What's this all about? Why won't you let us through?" Um, he then managed to kind of budge through them to knock the door, and he said, "Can we interview you?" And she said, "Yes." So his Chinese translator then said, "We've got permission to do this," and they basically wouldn't say anything. And he asked through the window, "Why do you want to stand?" And she said, "Because it's my right." But before she could say anything else, they put this kind of canvas over the window. The woman looked quite disconcerted, and she said to the Chinese translator she didn't know who they were. Um, anyway, that was it basically. They tried their best to get a further interview, but these 20 individuals were basically preventing them from doing so, and it ended in a bit of rough and tumble, and yeah, they ended up having to abandon it. So, a few things to look at here. Firstly, this is not a new development. There has long been a case where by outside journalists have been harassed and found their work very difficult in China. Um, for example, last year in the Yangtze ferry disaster, the BBC tried getting interviews, and again, same story. These guys in black costumes, they tend to wear dark clothes for some reason, kind of pushed them away. And there was another example in Beijing where they wanted to interview some lawyers involved in the torture case. So basically, what we see here is an utter lack of transparency. Um, Supposedly, these guys are some sort of local police, but I think the reality is they're thugs hired by the local branch of the Communist Party. Um, Anyone who thinks that China is a democracy, I had a civil but somewhat tense debate with an acquaintance of mine, and she tried to insist. Um, this person isn't a friend; she's an acquaintance I know through various channels. But basically, I remember I spent time with her in Shanghai, and she tried to insist that China was a democracy, and there was different parties took part. And we had a bit of an argument. Well, not an argument; it was civil, but yeah, it's just not true, and this proves it. The totalitarian regimes all over the world, especially China, kind of look to the United States and say, and they look at the frenetic nature of the American election, and they say, "Oh well, if that's democracy, we don't want it." So they kind of use that as a way to justify their own crackdown, and that's really unfortunate because number one, not every democracy has as frenetic a situation as the American situation was. And I admit it probably isn't the best advertisement for democracy. Nevertheless, we are seeing a peaceful transition of power. people, for the most part, voted freely. And I would much rather have a chaotic democracy than a perfect totalitarian system. And to me, this just shows that our cowardice of the communist regime. They don't want anyone to have an alternative point of view. Now, one aspect of this did surprise me. I first saw it posted on the Shanghaiist website, and then I saw it on the BBC itself. I did expect, I did expect the 50 Cent Army to come out in force. That is the kind of nickname for these cyber nationalists. Often young people who are very extreme in their nationalism, and they will always defend the Communist Party and say, "Oh, pesky outside interference, mind your own business," all this sort of thing. But on this occasion, they didn't. I actually saw a number of Chinese netizens admitting it was a problem, and that I must admit surprised me because usually the response, and I'm sure they did, there were some of them as well. Usually, the response by the 50 Cent Brigade, these so-called micro nationalists, is to aggressively try and harass anyone with a different point of view. I've seen it before. Um, so a few things to say. Firstly, I don't think it's said enough. I've been very critical of the media, and I have been critical of the BBC before, and I'm sure I will be in the future. But we should remember that there are frontline journalists who took real risks. Now, this isn't as dangerous as reporting from Iraq or a war zone, but you do run the risk of your equipment getting damaged, being roughed up, possibly interrogated, losing visas, this sort of thing. So they do run the risk of getting a lot of hassle. Um, and I think we have to commend the courage of frontline journalists. You know, in the end of the day, they're just trying to do a job. They're trying to simply interview this candidate. It's not like the BBC man was projecting his view of the situation and just saying, "Oh, this is what is happening." He wanted to interview the candidate herself to try and get a perspective of what was happening. And you know, one thing I would say to the 50 Cent Brigade, they're always complaining about biased Western media. Well, how do you expect Western media outlets to get the full picture when you won't let them? When local communist thugs are hired to stop them doing their job? How are they supposed to get the whole picture? So you're kind of shooting your foot in with that one, shooting your own foot. It's absurd, utterly absurd. Um, I do think Theresa May should raise this issue the next time we have a trade meeting. Raise it politely, but say, Mr. Xi or Mr. Lee, um, you know, we will not accept our journalists being harassed simply for doing their job. They're not breaking any Chinese laws. Um, in fact, in the Chinese constitution regarding this process, it also says that any Chinese citizen over the age of 18 is eligible to stand as a candidate. Now, that's in the Chinese constitution. Of course, like most communist regimes, they don't listen to their own constitution. Um, so, yeah, it's unsettling to watch, but it is also important that it is being shown to the outside world. And shame on people who defend this. Journalists should have a right to do their job. That doesn't mean that media outlets can't be criticised. And before anyone accuses me of hypocrisy, because I've been very vocal about Russia Today, I would never propose RT journalists being roughed up. Okay, I would never propose that. I do think RT is a very dubious network. I do think it's an organ of the Russian government, but I would never propose RT reporters get beaten up or something. That would be going too far. When it comes to the power of the media, I really believe yes, the media needs to be held to account, but we also have to support journalists working in difficult situations to do their job. And yeah, so that's it really. I'll try and put a link to this if I can. But shame on the CCP for being cards, and shame on the thugs who are trying to stop a journalist doing his job.